This presentation is about Deuteronomy, which is the fifth book of the books of Moses, or the Pentateuch. Deuteronomy means something like the second law, and it largely is a reiteration and reinterpretation of laws and other items that had been given earlier. These are reiterated, the covenant is represented, and many of the laws are represented to a later generation, and so it serves a pedagogical or teaching function for those who had not been at Sinai, who had not been in Egypt, a later generation, for them to also be partakers of the covenant and understand that they are the beneficiaries of the covenant and the laws. The outline or structure of the book of Deuteronomy is fairly simple. It is really 4 speeches given by Moses, but I will organize these according to the flow and movement of the story and by literary type. And so chapters 1 through 4, the historical prologue, chapters 5 through 11, the heart of the law, chapters 12 through 26, statutes and ordinances, that is case law, chapters 27 through 28, blessings and curses, chapters 29 and 30, some concluding exhortations, chapters 31 through 33, Moses passes his authority on to Joshua, and the tradition is preserved in the Ark of the Covenant, and also containing a couple of lengthy poems. Finally, chapter 34, the death of Moses. Deuteronomy is, of course, the last book of the Pentateuch, as you see from this scheme, but it also has a great deal in common with the books that follow. And so it is a kind of a strange book. Number one, it's a book of sermons, not a book of narratives for the most part. And secondly, it seems to provide closure for the Pentateuch, but also it points forward to the books of Joshua through 2 Kings that follow. There are several approaches that have been promulgated to try to understand this. First, the traditional approach is that Deuteronomy is the last book of the 5-book collection known as the Pentateuch, or the 5 books. That's it. Secondly is the theory by a scholar in the early 19th century, that is the 1800s, that the law book found in the temple during Josiah's reign, King Josiah's reign in 622 BC, many hundreds of years after the Exodus, was a portion of or all of the book of Deuteronomy. Building on this was a German scholar named Martin Noth, who suggested that Deuteronomy is really the introduction to the historical books and not really connected to the books of the Pentateuch. It serves then as the introduction to the historical books and doesn't really conclude the Pentateuch. It really is misplaced in the Pentateuch. Patrick Miller's theory recognizes both of these theories, the traditional one and Martin Noth's theory, and he suggests that Deuteronomy both closes the Pentateuch. After all, Moses dies at the end of Deuteronomy, and opens the historical books because it points forward to how they're supposed to act, what they're supposed to do once they come into the land, and what they're not supposed to do. And so he calls it a boundary document. And by boundary document, he simply means it's a literary boundary, that is, it closes the Pentateuch and it opens the historical books, so it's like a door that swings 2 ways. But it's also a boundary document in the sense that Israel receives these teachings when the Israelites are poised on the boundary of the land of Canaan, receiving final instructions before going in to take the land. And so my opinion also is that it is a kind of boundary, a literary and physical boundary document, that it both closes the Pentateuch and opens the historical books. But the book of Deuteronomy, even more than Exodus, is a covenant document. We said quite a bit about covenant when we talked about Exodus. There is a covenant form, especially that of the suzerainty covenant, or covenant of a great king with his vassals or lesser kings, or people that he is graciously giving his covenant to. And those suzerainty treaties or covenants have forms and flows that are very similar, especially to the book of Deuteronomy. Let me give a list of these. Number one, the king introduces himself, and that is a preface or a self-introduction. I am King Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, king of Babylon, king of the four quarters, king of the regions of the world, king of the universe, etc. There is often a historical prologue, something like, I have saved you people from the marauding bands of Arabs, therefore you should obey me. And in Deuteronomy, we have both of these as well. God introduces himself and gives historical recounting of how he had saved them in the wilderness and helped them in chapters 1 through 3 of the book of Deuteronomy, and also the historical prologue to the Ten Commandments in chapter 5. I am the Lord your God, introduction, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, the historical prologue. In the ancient Near Eastern covenant treaties, or suzerainty covenants, there are covenant stipulations. That is, what does the king require that people do? And sometimes these are quite lengthy. In the book of Deuteronomy, we have a section of statutes and ordinances in chapters 12 through 26. That is, case laws. This is how they're to behave. But also in chapter 5 especially, there are many, there's the Ten Commandments, and in the chapters that follow, 6 through 11, also various kinds of stipulations of the covenant. Here's how you ought to behave in the land which you are about to enter. The suzerainty covenants of the ancient world also had blessings and curses, sometimes very extensive. And in Deuteronomy, we also have this, chapters 27 and 28, a series of curses and blessings. Curses for failure to keep the covenant, blessings for compliance and keeping the covenant. Ancient Near Eastern covenants also had invoked witnesses to the covenant, usually divine witnesses, calling upon several gods to act as witness to the covenant. In the book of Deuteronomy, we have a couple of mentions in chapter 4:26 and 30:19. Heaven and earth are called upon to act as witnesses because there is no one higher than God that can be invoked to act as witness. And so God simply calls upon all of creation to act as witness to this legal document or covenant. In the ancient Near Eastern treaties, there's also provision for reading and safekeeping the covenant. That is, write the covenant down and then keep it somewhere safe so that it can be referred to, it can be read periodically, and people's memory can be renewed. Chapter 31, we have the Ten Commandments, or the two tablets, placed in the Ark of the Covenant for safekeeping, so that they can be referred to. The Ten Commandments, the tablets of stone kept safe. And finally, there's covenant sacrifice in the ancient Near Eastern covenants that ratify the covenant. In fact, most covenants are ratified through sacrifice in the ancient world. Covenant sacrifice is also mentioned in chapter 11, also later on in the book, in the blessings and curses section of 27 and 28, that the sacrifice in Deuteronomy would come later, once they enter the land of Canaan, and that happens in Joshua 8, verses 30 through 35. And so one can see a very close similarity in relationship in form, not theology, not content really, but relationship in form. They used the traditional form for a covenant in the ancient world. Let's talk for a few moments about the contents then of Deuteronomy. Chapters 1 through 11 are memory of wilderness wanderings and the initial conquests in chapters 1 through 3. The nature of the Torah, chapters 5 and 6, and commands to avoid idolatry, especially in 7 and following. This section begins and ends in chapter 1. It begins and ends with a memory of their rebellion in the wilderness. At Kadesh Barnea in the Tzin desert, Numbers 13 and 14, and the rebellion of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram in Numbers 16. As Israel is poised on the brink of the promised land, she should take heed. She has been here before, but refused to go into the land of promise. That is in Deuteronomy 1:26, with reference to the report of the spies in Numbers 13 and 14. Or then they tried to go in under their own terms and not God's terms in Deuteronomy 1:41. Chapters 2 and 3 are the retelling of the story of their wanderings from Kadesh Barnea to the plains of Moab. And reasons are given there for why they did not attack Moab, Edom, and Ammon, because they're in fact distant relatives. But they do attack the kingdoms of Sihon and Og and are successful in eradicating the east of the Jordan area we refer to as the Transjordan of these Amorite kings and their kingdoms, of Sihon and Og, kings of the Amorites. Chapter 4 gives a reason for why Moses is retelling these stories. Well, none of them, with the exception of Joshua and Caleb, had in fact been there much earlier at Sinai and in Egypt. But the explicit reasons are so that they may live and not die in the wilderness, and to remind them of the Lord and their requirement to follow him and love him in first place. Chapter 5 gives us an almost verbatim retelling of the Ten Commandments, with almost no change except for the warrant for the Sabbath commandment is slightly different in Deuteronomy than in Exodus. But the Ten Commandments section begins not with the Ten Commandments, but with the contemporizing nature of these laws and of the Exodus and Sinai and the covenant in the wilderness and the giving of the law. These are not to be considered ancient history, but had relevance for the generation of Israelites 40 years later, that they may not think that these do not apply to them, but they must think of themselves as having been in Egypt and at Sinai, even though it's 40 years later. The rest of the commands given after the Ten Commandments are simply interpretations. They're the statutes, the ordinances, the testimonies, and all are interpretations of the Ten Commandments or specific applications of those Ten Commandments. They are the halakha, that is, the walk, the ethical walk, how Israelites ought to walk, considering that they have received these stories, the Haggadah, which means the stories, which are the narratives of God's gracious intervention in their past. Chapter 6, we're given the meaning of the statutes and ordinances, wrapped up in the Shema, which simply means hear, the command to hear. And that is, in chapter 6, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one, and you shall love the Lord with all your heart and soul and strength, and speak of him when you get up and when you lie down and when you go out of your house, and post it on your forehead and on your hand and on your gates, etc. Internalize the law. But the meaning of Torah, in fact, is no different than it is expressed in the New Testament, and that is the meaning of the giving of the law is to love the Lord your God with heart and soul and strength, with your all. Torah is, in fact, grace, and the fundamental aspect of Torah is the loving response to God's goodness in delivering them and blessing them. That's why this is not legalism. One behaves in a way commensurate with God's grace, because God's grace compels and draws us to him, and he requires that his covenant people behave in an ethical way, because that is the good life for everybody. But that is not what makes them Israelites. What makes them Israelites, what makes them saved, is that God saved them out of bondage and delivered them. Now they should behave as saved people. Chapter 7 deals with the inhabitants of the land of Canaan. They're to annihilate the idolaters. And we're told that God is going to give them the land of the Canaanites, not because they're great, not because they're many, not because they're mighty, but because of God's love and his faithfulness to the promises given to the patriarchs back in the book of Genesis. Chapter 8 reiterates God's grace in bringing them through the wilderness. And in fact, I think we need to look at Deuteronomy as a covenant book, and not only a covenant book, but a book predominantly about the God of grace, the God of God's gracious actions in their past. Chapters 9 and 10 remind them, don't behave like you did at Kadesh Barnea, in saying, these Canaanites and the giant Anakim are mightier than we are, and we can't take the land. Therefore, we cannot succeed. And he retells their rebellion in the wilderness, the golden calf, the story of Tabira, the place of burning, and the rebellion at Kadesh Barnea, etc. Don't behave like that, but trust in God. Chapter 11 is how one should respond to God's grace. One loves the Lord by keeping his statutes and ordinances, which are for their good, and not because God is arbitrary or mean, but they're for their good, and safeguard the covenant by safeguarding the good of all the people. What follows in chapters 12 through 26 are, in fact, those statutes and ordinances, the case laws, the interpretations of the covenant. This is a picture of the god El, Canaanite deity. This is an ancient scroll of the Pentateuch. This is a carving of it says Shema Yisrael, that is, Hear, O Israel, that is at the heart of Jewish religion even today. These are tefillin, or phylacteries, that modern Jews, going way back, literally do bind on their forehead and on their hands in order to remind them of the Shema. What is the heart of religion? That is to love the Lord your God with your heart and soul and strength. And these are modern Jews at the Western Wall in Jerusalem, in fact, wearing those phylacteries. This is a picture of the law code of Hammurabi, the second millennium BC, in the Akkadian or Assyro-Babylonian language, and Deuteronomy's covenant code is very similar to, or the law code, the statutes and ordinances are very similar to Hammurabi's laws in many ways. I'm not going to be going over the statutes and ordinances in any detail whatsoever. I will make a few comments. Deuteronomy 12 through 26 is one of 3 law codes in the Old Testament. The others are Exodus 21 through 23, the covenant code, Leviticus 17 through 26, the holiness code, and then the Deuteronomic law code in chapters 12 through 26 of this book. Chapter 12 deals with idolatry and the need to centralize their worship around the tabernacle and to avoid the practices of the Canaanites. Chapter 13 is what to do with false prophets or those who worship idols. Chapter 14 deals with purity laws. Chapter 15, laws about slaves and the sacrifice or what one does to consecrate the firstborn. Chapter 16 deals with the Passover and other festivals, and the law of the king, and that is when they get in the land, they may in fact have a king, but how that king ought to behave. Chapter 18 deals with Levites and avoiding Canaanite practices. Chapter 19 deals with the cities of refuge. We first encountered these in the book of Numbers. Chapter 20 is about holy war. We've talked about that before. Chapter 21, what to do with homicide, what to do with wives taken in war, multiple wives, rebellious sons, and capital punishment. Chapter 22 deal with household laws and with adultery. Chapter 23, purity laws and laws pertaining to Ammonites, Moabites, and Edomites. Chapter 24, more marriage laws and laws relating to loans and labor. Chapter 25, levirate law, that is the law of the brother-in-law that should marry the wife of the dead brother if he left no male child. Just weights and measures and what to do about the Amalekites, the desert-dwelling Amalekites. Chapter 26 has to do with first fruits offering and some concluding comments to these laws. Chapter 27 and 28 are the blessings and curses that they're supposed to yell across to each other, half of Israel standing on Mount Ebal and half on Mount Gerizim when they go into the land, and that happens in Joshua chapter 8. Half stand on one mountain, half stand on the other, and yell across. One yells the blessings, the other yells the curses. They're commanded there to sacrifice and ratify the covenant of Deuteronomy when they arrive in Canaan by saying these blessings and curses. And in fact, this is somehow the sacrifice. Let me suggest that it's not unlike the sacrifice that Abraham does in chapter 15 of Genesis. He cuts the animals in half, and the Lord himself passes between the pieces as the sun goes down and invokes upon himself the curses of the covenant if he does not keep the terms of the covenant with Abraham. This is not unlike that. You've got 2 mountains. Israel is divided with a valley between, as if to say, may Israel itself be rent asunder. May we be cut in half if we do not keep the terms of the covenant. And so they themselves become, in a sense, the covenant sacrifice, as well as the offering of many sacrifices in Joshua chapter 8. Chapters 29 through 31 are Moses' final exhortations. Chapter 29, a command to remember God's provision in the wilderness and in Egypt. The command to refrain from idolatry, lest the curses of the covenant come upon them and they lose the land as a result. Chapter 30, more blessings for repentance and faithfulness. And Moses sets before them two ways, the way of life and the way of death. Chapter 31, Moses' final commands and concluding statements about the book of the law and its placement in the Ark of the Covenant. Chapters 32 and 33 are the Song of Moses and the Blessing of Moses. These are ancient poems that retell some of these stories. And then finally, the death of Moses recorded in chapter 34. And then he is buried in a place no one knows and cannot find. His people try to find him after the Lord buries him, and no one ever finds the body. And thus ends the Pentateuch.